I've always been a collector. Not of stamps or of coins, but of voices. It started innocently enough in my 20s when I inherited my grandfather's old phonograph and a crate of dusty records from his cluttered attic. He was a quiet man, a widower who spent his final years alone in a creaky house on the outskirts of town, surrounded by the ghosts of his past. I'd visit him as a kid, listening to those records spin tales of jazz legends and wartime broadcasts, the needle scratching like a faltering heartbeat against the oppressive silence, the crackle of vinyl, the way a voice could drag you backward through time. It hooked me. There was something profoundly intimate about it, like cradling a fragment of someone's soul in your palms. As I grew older, that fascination twisted into obsession. I began scouring estate sales, forsaken attics, and shadowy online auctions for rare audio relics. Forgotten speeches from obscure politicians, eerie field recordings of tempests and prowling wildlife, even whispers etched onto ancient wax cylinders from the turn of the century. My apartment, a cramped two-bedroom in a decaying building on the city's fraying edge, became a shrine to them. Walls lined with shelves groaned under the weight of tapes, reels, and digital archives, each item meticulously labeled and cataloged. The air hung heavy with a faint, musty scent, like brittle paper and the ozone tang of overheating electronics. Friends drifted away one by one, branding me reclusive, a hermit entombed in his audio mausoleum. "You need to get out more, Alex," my last close friend Mark had said of a coffee 2 years ago, his voice edged with pity. "This hobby, it's devouring you." But who needs company when you have the echoes of the dead? They were reliable, unchanging, always waiting in the dim glow of my screens. My job, transcribing interviews for a podcast network, paid the bills. But it was mechanical drudgery, performed in solitary confinement from home. Relationships, they'd withered long ago. No one could compete with the spectral symphony that haunted my nights. In truth, I preferred it that way. The world outside was chaotic, unpredictable. My collection was my sanctuary, a meticulously controlled universe where I reigned as curator, the god of forsaken sounds. It was a rainy autumn night when I acquired the piece that unraveled everything. The storm raged on unrelentingly, sheets of water battering my window like skeletal fingers clawing for entry, the wind wailing through the building's cracked frame like distant, anguished cries. I'd been prowling an obscure online auction site, one of those digital black markets where collectors like me bartered in the esoteric and the forbidden. The listing seized my attention. An unmarked cassette tape from a defunct asylum in upstate New York, shuttered since the 1970s after a scandal of patient atrocities. The seller's description was cryptic, almost taunting. "Voices from Ward 7, not for the faint of heart. Proceed with caution." No audio samples, no provenance, just a starting bid of $50. My heart thundered as I placed my offer, fingers darting over the keyboard in the computer's sickly glow. Bids crept in from other faceless users, but I outbid them all, fueled by that intoxicating thrill of the hunt. When I won, a surge of triumph coursed through me, a fleeting warmth against the chill seeping through the walls like insidious fog. The package arrived 2 days later, sodden from the unending rain, in a plain brown envelope with no return address. I tore it open with eager hands, the paper shredding with a brittle crunch. Inside lay the cassette, its plastic shell scuffed and yellowed with age, the tape wound tight like a serpent coiled in weight. A faint, acrid odor clung to it, mildew mingled with antiseptic, evoking sterile hospital corridors long forsaken to rot and echoes. My hands trembled as I slid it into my vintage player, a hulking machine I'd restored myself, its dials pulsing with faint, unearthly light. Isolation had its advantages, no interruptions to my sacred rituals. I dimmed the light until the room swam in the erratic flicker of a single candle, its flame casting elongated shadows that writhed across the shelves like living entities. The scent of melting wax blended with the apartment's inherent mustiness, forging an atmosphere thick with ritualistic dread. I sank into my worn armchair, the leather groaning like a sigh from the grave, and pressed play. At first there was only static, like thunder rumbling through a shroud of fog, punctuated by the sporadic pops and hisses of decayed magnetic tape. I leaned forward, straining to listen, my breath shallow in the suffocating hush. Then a whisper slithered forth, faint and fractured. "Help me. They're coming." It was a woman's voice, raw with terror, as if dredged from the depths of a bottomless well. More joined it, a chorus of murmurs overlapping like shadows bleeding into one another, each laced with desperate weight. I could almost feel them grazing my skin, cool and insistent like spectral breaths. Patience ensnared in endless nights of torment, walls oozing viscous shadows, figures skulking just beyond sight in padded cells. One voice, a man's gravelly rasp, described pursuit by the Watchers, entities that feasted on screams with insatiable hunger. My pulse raced, a cocktail of exhilaration and creeping unease. This was no ordinary find. It was a masterpiece, a crown jewel that would exalt my hoard to mythic status in the niche forums I haunted. I listened until the tape clicked to a halt, the ensuing silence heavier, more oppressive, like a shroud settling over a corpse. But that night, as I lay in bed, the whispers refused to die. The tape had ended hours ago, yet they seeped from the walls like damp rot after a flood, slithering into my ears, indistinct at first, like dead leaves scraping against glass. I dismissed it at first as exhaustion, my mind looping the audio in obsessive cycles, a peril I'd faced before after marathon sessions. The rain's relentless patter lulled me into fitful sleep, plagued by dreams of labyrinthine corridors and grasping hands emerging from the dark. When I woke the next morning, the apartment seemed unchanged, weak sunlight filtering through grimy curtains and pallid shafts. I shook off the lingering disquiet and catalogued the tape, labeling it Ward 7 Echoes in my precise script and shelving it beside a wax cylinder from a 19th century seance. Work distracted me, transcribing a tedious interview on urban legends, but my thoughts slunk back to the tape, the voices replaying, unbidden during pauses in my typing. By evening, as the sun sank and shadows elongated across the floor like accusing tendrils, the whispers returned, louder, snaking through the vents like acrid smoke. He's listening. Closer now. I froze, fork suspended midair, the room abruptly frigid. I checked the player. It was off, unplugged. A trick of the wind, I rationalized, or the building's decrepit plumbing moaning in agony. Yet unease gnawed at me, a relentless itch burrowing beneath my skin. My sanctuary felt constricted, the corner shadows stretching like judgmental fingers, observing me with unseen eyes. Isolation breeds paranoia, or so I'd read in a psychology tome scavenged from a flea market, lured by its chapter on auditory hallucinations. But I wasn't mad. I was discerning, a connoisseur. Still, doubt wormed in. That afternoon I tried calling Mark, but it rang to voicemail. His recorded voice sounded remote, almost derisive. Leave a message if you're still alive in there. I hung up wordlessly, the silence magnifying my solitude like an echo in a void. To distract myself, I played a safer recording, a quaint folk song from the 1920s. But even it felt corrupted. The singer's lilt laced with an undercurrent of unspoken grief I'd never detected before. As night descended, the whispers intensified, a threading through the air like invisible veins. I paced the room, floorboards creaking like brittle bones, my shadows warped grotesquely by candlelight. Sleep eluded me. Closing my eyes only amplified the murmurs, weaving tales of betrayal and loss. By dawn, I was gaunt, dark circles carving bruises into my face like marks of the damned. On the third night, the horrors surged beyond whispers. I jolted awake to a cacophony, not mere murmurs, but pleas and screams muffled as if sealed behind fogged glass. They emanated from every shelf, every device, saturating the apartment in a dissonant symphony of despair. The old phonograph whirred to life unbidden, its needle gouging a garbled confession from a long-dead murderer. The blood, it calls to me. A reel-to-reel hissed accusation in a child's shrill voice. You locked us away. Now we see you. Panic flooded me, my heart hammering like a funeral drum. I stumbled through the gloom, the air thick with dust and a metallic tang, like spilled blood. Shadows writhed unnaturally, pooling in corners and oozing toward me like inky veins. I ripped plugs from sockets, sparks flaring like dying embers, and shattered cassettes against the floor. Plastic shards scattering like splintered teeth. But the sounds endured, drilling into my skull, resonating in my bones. Join us, collector of souls. My hands quaked as realization crashed over me, cold and merciless. The Ward 7 tape wasn't a recording. It was a conduit, a key unlocking something festering in my hoard. All those voices I'd amassed, they weren't echoes. They were captives, spectral entities imprisoned in their mediums, ravenous for freedom, and I'd granted it through me, the obsessive fool who'd herded them under one roof. The room contracted, walls closing like a coffin's lid. I snatched the cursed tape from its shelf, intent on destruction, my fingers slick with clammy sweat. But as I did, the whispers erupted into a deafening roar, a maelstrom of sound that shuddered the windows and snuffed the candle in a plume of foul smoke. Shadows solidified into forms, ethereal figures with cavernous eyes and spindly limbs, their mouths shaping words that vibrated in my marrow, flickering like glitchy projections from a nightmare reel. They slithered across the floor, dark tendrils coiling around my ankles, cold as grave dirt. One touched me, its chill threading through my veins like frostbite, dredging up buried memories. My grandfather's solitary death, the friends I'd exiled, the void that birthed my obsession. In that instant, my curated world shattered into abject terror. I was no collector. I was the collection, a breathing repository for the damned, my isolation the ideal prison for their exodus. Panic tore at my chest, a feral dread eclipsing reason. With a desperate heave, I flung the tape into the candle's guttering flame. It ignited in a burst of noxious smoke, plastic warping and blistering like seared flesh. The whispers contorted into shrieks of agony, a torrent of torment, echoing before dissolving into an unnatural void. Shadows recoiled, slinking into crevices, and the figures evaporated into wisps. I crumpled to the floor, gasping, body quaking. Sweat drenched my clothes. The room reeked of scorched plastic and something fouler, like incinerated regret. Leaving it over, I dragged myself to the window, watching dawn bleed pale across the sky. The city stirred, indifferent to my nightmare. But as sunlight pierced the murk, I heard it, a faint murmur rising from my own throat. He's one of us now. Fresh horror seized me. I tried to scream, to beg for aid, but only echoes spilled forth. Not my voice, but shards of Ward 7 whispers fused with the murderer's rasp and the child's wail. My reflection in the glass revealed eyes no longer mine, hollow and voracious, gazing back with the hunger of the ensnared. The collection was complete. My body, the ultimate archive. A living phonograph, condemned to eternal playback. And in the hush of my unending isolation, I wait for the next listener to discover me, enticed by the whispers emanating from my flesh, drawing them into the gallery where voices never truly perish.